0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, herzlich willkommen to you all. Let's go to our first question, and it's from Nick in Dulwich. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Iain. Very briefly, do the panel agree that people who refuse the vaccine are being selfish because effectively they are dependent upon all the other people who do have the vaccine?
Does the panel agree that those who refuse the vaccines are selfish? Well, I guess this has been an ongoing argument in the country, and I suspect it's true in every country around the world. Those who refuse the vaccines are selfish. Let's go to Ulf first. What's the situation like in Germany? Is this debate a big one there?
Sure. It's the same situation everywhere, I presume. My personal opinion, if you don't get the vaccine, unless you have specific medical reasons, you're an idiot and you're selfish.
Well, that's what we like. Forthright views right from the start. Rosie, Duffield.
Hi, I wouldn't go quite that far, although I accept that's a point of view. But I know of quite a few young girls, friends, daughters, who are really quite worried about the fact that the vaccine hasn't been around that long, and they're worried about things like fertility, pregnant women that are also worried. So I don't know that they're all being selfish, especially women who are trying to protect their unborn children. But, I would encourage anyone and everyone to have it done, just because we're all protecting each other. And, the more people are vaccinated, the safer we know it is.
I mean, even by saying that, giving those two examples that you just did, there was sort of a slight part of me that's thinking, even when we say that, it's almost... It almost allows people to think, well, that view is a right and proper one, because when you have the medical authorities now saying that it's completely safe for pregnant women. Admittedly, that's not what was said at the beginning of this, so I completely understand that sort of different things are being said at different stages of the pandemic. But as we get the knowledge, as we know more about the vaccines, and the medical authorities change their advice, should we even raise the prospect that there might be doubts from certain groups?
I think people should go ahead and have it done, and we do know more and more now. But certainly at the beginning, I was hearing from friends whose daughters were kind of 18, 19, 21, and really looking ahead and thinking, is this entirely safe? And I think they all were sort of acting as though they wanted to see how many people were still safe having had it done. And I think the more it's rolled out, the more we can see and be assured that it is safe for everybody. But yeah, it's scary if you're sort of, I'm past that stage, but if you're thinking about starting a family, these kind of things have to be considered. I don't think that's particularly selfish. I think that's cautious, isn't it?
Benjamin Butterworth.
Well, I think it's definitely selfish, but the thing that's kind of made me feel ashamed as someone in my 20s is that a third of people in my age bracket still haven't had the vaccine. Now, they've all been offered it at this point, and, there are questions about why that is. There's certainly a fringe of hardcore anti-vaxxers who simply believe it's some kind of con, that they buy into conspiracy theories, and there'll be a handful of those people, and that'll be why they haven't got it. But the reason I'm ashamed to be a young person at this time is because I think there is a group of people who simply can't be bothered to get it, who think, well, they're not at any serious risk from COVID, which is true, but they don't want to get it because of that, because they seemingly don't care about the effects on the rest of society. And so that's why I think things like the COVID passport suggestion, i.e. that you would need to show proof of your jabs to get into a nightclub, I think stuff like that is a good idea. The reason that you have to have it to go on holiday without having to quarantine, because I think there is that group of people that will be pushed into doing the sensible thing and getting the vaccine with a little bit of encouragement.
You've presumably got a lot of friends your own age. Do you have vibrant discussions with them about this?
Do you know, I have to say, I don't actually. I was going to say I don't know anybody that's refused it. I knew someone that didn't want to get the jab, but about 2-3 months after that, they changed their mind. And I think that is the evidence that, take the black community, for example. They had one of the highest hesitancy rates, but I think it's halved since January for polling, because they've seen their peers get it and they've been fine and they've gone on. But with young people, that won't happen, because I don't think they're scared of the consequences of the vaccine. I think they're slightly careless about it. And so I just really hope that there is the pressure, the things like the COVID passports, to make them go out and get it, because we need to get to that herd immunity figure if we're going to get past this. And also the suggestion from the fall that we've had in recent weeks is that once schools closed, that was a big part of the transmission that was sending cases higher. So that shows that there's a real value in teenagers as well as people my age.
Stewart Jackson.
Well, it seems amazing that at this stage in human development, where people have never had so much access to impartial information about their own health and their own future health, that, we're so complacent in this country, a large number of people, particularly people under 30 now, that we're ignoring the fact that there are millions of billions of people around the world that don't have the opportunity to access vaccines to tackle COVID. And there's a kind of narcissism that we're saying, well, our civil liberties are more important. Now, I set aside people who have really sincere ethical or medical issues. But frankly, there's too much over-concentration on social media, on myths, on nonsense spread by hardcore anti-vaxxers. And whilst I wouldn't call people idiotic or stupid, with the exception of a number of people where there will always be a risk of a reaction against vaccination, the vast bulk of people of all ages who are all at risk of this, it's better for them to take the vaccine. And I just can't understand why these myths about infertility or problems with pregnancy or blood clots are being entertained, because you've got to trust someone ultimately. And at the end of the day, this is about your health and the health of your family and your community. And unless people do develop herd immunity effectively, or enough people, and we're almost there in terms of the antibodies, then this is going to be a consistent problem over years and years.
Let's widen this out a bit and look at the decision today to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to get the vaccine. Now, I don't know what the take-up there will be. Apparently the law says they don't have to get parental permission, but if that is expanded to, say, 11 to 15-year-olds, there will have to be parental permission. And you can imagine some of the arguments that will be going on in houses up and down the country. Rosie, what do you make of the decision today? Do you think it's the right one to vaccinate 16 and 17-year-olds?
Yeah, I think the JCVI was initially hesitant, wasn't it, because of the sort of data, but now assuring us that has been really looked at and it is safe. It was odd to read with my 18-year-old that there were going to be arguments in households and that young people were supposed to be persuading their parents, because usually with all the people we know, it's the other way around. And definitely with young people that I'm around, the carrot approach is much better than the stick. My son's about to go to a festival in a few weeks, just after he'll have had his first jab, kind of settling in for that 3-week period. So, but yeah, I think I read today that the government were considering financial incentives to young people. I think all of those things will work, but the passports and the sort of coming down heavily does not work usually with people that age. Trust me, I'm a mum of a 22-year-old and an 18-year-old, but 16 and 17-year-olds, I think, if they're explained, if it's explained to them properly and carefully that this is safe and that they're protecting their family, I think they probably will be. Young people aren't all just selfish, not at all in my experience.
I'm just imagining how you're feeling with your 18-year-old son going to a festival for the first time. That would be frightening me more than any risk of getting COVID,
it is quite scary, yeah. It's usually quite well behaved, but
usually, yeah, there's that caveat, isn't there? Benjamin, vaccines for 16, 17-year-olds.
I mean, so long as the scientists say that it's safe, then I think that's the right thing to do. And I dare say a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds will want it because, of course, among the people that have been worst affected by lockdowns and the pingdemic and the rest of it is people taking their exams and at school. And we know that these vaccines reduce the chance of passing it on. So if it can reduce the number of people spreading it in schools, then, these 16 and 17-year-olds have learned it a harder way than most of us, frankly. Being sent home from work for 2 weeks, if you have an office-based job, isn't nearly as hard as losing out on, the weeks before your A-levels. So I dare say they'll be desperate to get it.
Stewart, you've got a young daughter, I believe.
Yeah, and I think, Iain, you touched on the point about 11 to 15-year-olds. I think that is a separate situation because given the fact that the government identified that age group as pretty low risk, I think there will be many more parents who are saying, look, we're not prepared to take the risk of a reaction of vaccination for that age group. Broadly speaking, yeah, I agree with 16 and 17-year-olds with one caveat that they should be offered a choice of vaccines. Most older people have taken the AstraZeneca. I think the advice is that the Pfizer jab and the Moderna vax jab is probably more suitable for younger people. But I think you're going to have a large abstention rate with that age group anyway, because for the reasons Benjamin said, either apathy or people genuinely concerned about the health implications. So that's a different issue to more at-risk groups.
And Ulf, in Germany, obviously the vaccine roll-up has sped up over the last few months. Has it got to the stage where 16, 17-year-olds are going to be vaccinated as well?
Yes, the government took the decision, I think today, that everybody between 12 and 17 years old can get vaccinated. There was a bit of a row over it because the STIKO, the Permanent Commission on Vaccination, has not yet decided whether to recommend that. They are scientists. They said we haven't got enough data yet. Quit pressuring us. And the government said we're going to go ahead anyway. So now it will be all right for kids above 12 to get vaccinated. It will be interesting to see how many people will take up this offer.
You see, that's really interesting, isn't it? That in Germany, the government say, I don't care what the scientists say, we're doing it anyway. If Boris Johnson stood up in the House of Commons and said that, Rosie, you'd be all over him, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, he's got science. I mean, there are people that think he has ignored or been slightly, blasé about the science in the past. But yeah, absolutely. The British people are used to these daily briefings. We're used to seeing those Public Health England people, and the scientists are household names, aren't they? So we need to know that all those people we've come to trust are saying it's okay. And, as long as we can, I think that's an added incentive to get everyone vaccinated.
Ulf, do you think that's the right thing to do for the government, just to essentially ignore the scientists?
51-49, I don't think it's a good idea.
At least you didn't say 50. At least you didn't say 52-48, Ulf.
It was on the tip of my tongue, and I stamped on it. That's what you got scientists for. The Latin root for that is knowledge. They know things. Angela Merkel is a physicist, not a virologist, so she should listen to the experts. And we are not in such a hurry. I think one reason is that we got so much vaccine left over these days that there is a certain danger that we must throw away at least part of it, and nobody wants that. So that's a non-scientific reason too. I'm not really happy about this. I don't think it will cause much damage, or if any at all, but I don't like the way protocol has been ignored here.
Nick in Dulwich, who asked the original question, let me just read out this text to you that I've just seen on my screen here. It says, calling people selfish is so counterproductive. Empathy requires us to understand motivation behind people's belief that vaccinations are not the solution. I'm double vaccinated, but my partner is not willing to take her second vaccine. She's in the BAME community. And then he goes on. Do you not, Nick, accept that if we go around calling people selfish and stupid or whatever, it's just going to entrench them in their positions, isn't it? It's not going to persuade anyone.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? But then selfish might be, a pointed word, but it is actually quite accurate. And then I do have a couple of other points, because I think these myths that Rosie talked about the the infertility and stuff, those are arguments that are put forward by the libertarian community, not just the anti-vaxxers. They are, it's been jumped on by libertarian people to sort of promote the personal rights against the collective, good. And also, I think the whole thing has its roots in the old Andrew Wakefield MMR scandal that hasn't really gone away. And bearing in mind how vaccines have been probably the single best thing medically as a public health, improvement in the history of the world, it is incredible that we're still having this debate.
Well, I rather agree with you. Nick, thank you very much indeed. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. If you haven't called yet, but you've got a burning question that you want to ask our panel, 0345 6060 973. It's 16 minutes past 8.
LBC.
Let's
8:30. Let me reintroduce my panel to you. Rosie Duffield is Labour MP for Canterbury. Stewart Jackson, former Conservative MP for Peterborough. Benjamin Butterworth is senior reporter at the iPaper. And we have Ulf in Hamburg. If you're a regular listener to the programme, you will have heard his dulcet tones on the programme, often when we talk about Brexit and European-related issues. Mike is in Beverley and has our next question. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Iain. Thanks for having me on.
Hi. Hi.
I wondered what the panel thought Boris Johnson and the government's standing, or how the world appraised Boris Johnson and the present government.
I'm tempted to come to Ulf again first, but I'm going to resist temptation for now and go to Benjamin.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the world doesn't hold Boris Johnson in a high regard. You know, if you look at the US, which is meant to be our greatest ally, he is widely considered to be a British version of Donald Trump. And when Donald Trump was the US president, he gladly appeared to align himself with that view of the world for the short-term benefits. I think in Europe, and Ulf will be able to fill us in, you know, they wonder what's happened to Britain with Boris Johnson. They look at him as a comic, as a farce. You know, that scene with him unable to open his umbrella the other day. I think things like that...
Oh, come on, we've all done that.
Well, but this is the Prime Minister we're talking about, and he gladly makes these jokes, these farces, in a way that clearly win over people in this country. But I think it embarrasses us on the world stage. You know, my favourite Prime Minister is Tony Blair. So that's some way from Boris Johnson, arguably. But there was a man that looked like a leader, that respected the office, that behaved with dignity at all times. You know, even John Major, Margaret Thatcher. Boris Johnson isn't in their ilk, and I think he's letting Britain down on the world stage in a big way.
How old were you when Tony Blair came to power?
5, and then he left when I was 15, and I've spent the rest of my life wishing that I was maybe 10 years older so I could have enjoyed it.
Stewart Jackson, we should explain to our listeners, as well as being a former Conservative MP, you were David Davis's special advisor, chief of staff, when he was Brexit secretary. Now, David once said to me, and I don't think I'm telling tales out of court here, I probably am actually, but anyway, I'm going to do it. He said that when he would go around different European capitals, he found that half of the people that he met loved Boris Johnson and the other half just didn't. And he spent half his life sort of clearing up after Boris Johnson. Was that an accurate description?
Well, you know, he's a Marmite character in the European Union. I mean, he's taken the UK out of the European Union after 40-odd years. They're not going to like him, particularly people like the German government, the French government, who are wedded to this European federalist model. You know, the fundamental issue is that he exerted our sovereign right to make a decision with a popular mandate from the people, which has been confirmed by a general election just over 18 months ago, an emphatic win with an 80-seat majority. And I would challenge Benjamin. I mean, there's no polling evidence about American voters. A lot of American voters actually quite like Boris on an anecdotal level. He's got a good relationship with Joe Biden.
I mean, Joe Biden is the one that compared him to Donald Trump before Joe Biden
alleged.
became president.
I mean, Joe Biden has never said anything in public which is disobliging about Boris Johnson. You wouldn't expect him to. Obviously, there are elements of Joe Biden's administration that are hostile to Boris. But, you know, let's be honest, historically, he is polling at historically high levels in opinion polls.
Well, his approval ratings are actually lower now than they ever have been.
That's a relative. You know, when you look at Thatcher, Major, Blair, Gordon Brown, he's miles ahead of them at the same time, at the same juncture of his administration. And in terms of what he's had to cope with, Brexit, whether you were for or against, is a massive challenge for the country. On top of that, a global pandemic, and also coping with really fundamental political issues like social care and housing. I actually think if you're an average 5 or 6% in the polls ahead of the Labour Party after coming up to 12 years of a Tory government, you're actually not doing too badly.
In terms of what Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron think of him, I mean, it seems to me that they were both very suspicious at the beginning, but Merkel in particular, I think, seems to rather like him and treats him as a naughty schoolboy. She may not like a lot of the things that he does, but he's able to build a reasonable personal relationship with these people. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, well, of course, Ian, you touch on Angela Merkel, and I'll be interested in what our German friend says about Angela Merkel. But, I mean, she's a Brexit heroine because her arrogance and inflexibility at the beginning of 2016 in refusing to look at freedom of movement as a renegotiation with David Cameron actually effectively opened the door to Brexit. So I'm quite a fan of her, apart from the fact that, you know, this myth of German exceptionalism seems to rotate around her, that the Germans do everything better than anyone else in Europe, which clearly isn't the case. If you look at vaccinations, national resilience, their dubious ethical stance with Nord Stream and Russia and other human rights issues, you know, we're not any longer going to be lectured by people like Angela Merkel about why we're bad and they're good. And ditto Emmanuel Macron.
Well, you've teed up Ulf perfectly by saying some controversial things there. Ulf, the floor is yours.
Well, do you remember that one meeting in the EU when all the heads of state and government finally agreed on how the UK would leave the EU? How everybody was happy and slapped Boris Johnson on the shoulder and everything. So he was quite popular then, because finally we knew that we would be rid of you. Nobody is mad at the UK for leaving. Maybe because it took you so long, but that's about it. So that Boris Johnson is viewed negatively because he took you out. No, not really. He's viewed negatively for his world-class dishonesty. And mainly that. I mean, you sign a Northern Ireland Protocol and then you do everything to undermine it. You sign an agreement and then threaten to break it in a limited and specific way. Sorry, that's no way of making friends. That he's a buffoon, well, that's pardonable. That's not really relevant. That you can't rely on him. Actually, you can rely on him to cross you whenever that suits him. That's a problem.
Well, I think being lectured on propriety by a country that imposed fiscal waterboarding on the Irish, the Italians, the Portuguese, and particularly the Greeks is a bit rich. And when it comes to what Germany decides it wants to do, the German Constitutional Court decides which rulings of the European Court of Justice it agrees with and it doesn't. So I think if you're talking about agreeing something and then doing something completely different, it's not just Boris Johnson in the UK that stands guilty of that potentially.
Frankly, I don't recall lecturing you on anything. Seriously, I just explained why we don't trust Boris Johnson. That's all. You do you.
Well, if you can't, let's be honest, you can't on the one hand say that the UK is, well, you're glad to get rid of us, the inference being we're not that important, but at the same time saying, well, we're worried about a domestic politician in a, quote, third country and whether he's honest and decent and honourable. You can't have it both ways. The fact is that the difference between you and I is I respect the position of people in Germany, that the EU they have an emotional attachment to it for very good historical reasons, because it's a redemptive project which is important for the German people to work together for peace and prosperity. And I absolutely understand that. I think you should also, at the same time, do me the courtesy as a British Conservative to accept that people who took my view are not xenophobic, don't dislike the European Union, value and like you as neighbours and partners, but actually take an old-fashioned view that we want to run our own country and make our own laws. If that isn't so exceptional.
No, that of course isn't. And again, of course we can take a view on the reliability of the head of government of an ally. And if we think that man is dodgy, well, we'll treat him accordingly. We have no choice. Well, we are not lecturing you on anything. And frankly, the EU, a redemptive project, I think you are 30 years behind the time. My generation and younger people are not anymore in the business of redeeming ourselves for the sins of our grandfathers. We are aware of our history and we'll bear it in mind always. But the EU is a great thing. That's why It's a lucrative thing. It's a big market for our export industries. It's just fun to live in a big, well, not country, but a big market where you can live everywhere and you can move there without much trouble. That's the point. Redemption. Sorry.
Unless you've got 48% youth unemployment in Greece, and then it's fine, providing the German economy is tickety-boo. I mean, it isn't just... It is not just a one-way street.
OK, we could have you two debating for the rest of the programme, but I want to bring Rosie Duffield into this. I can imagine that you probably aren't particularly impressed by Boris Johnson's standing in Europe, Rosie.
No, absolutely not. And, Brexit, since we're on that subject, one of my favourites, my constituency has been affected by it more directly than almost any other in the UK, arguably more than any other. I mean, because we are literally, our neighbours are nearer on the continent than we are to many English towns and cities. And, I have an awful lot of EU constituents living and working in my constituency and travelling over and commuting. And our university calls itself the European University. We have language schools and we have families that have settled in and around Kent for a very long time. And it has been incredibly difficult for us. We voted to remain. It's been incredibly difficult for us just keeping those relationships going. And on a kind of almost monthly, weekly basis, I'm reassuring our neighbours that, we haven't forgotten them. We don't hate each other. I'm almost embarrassed about Brexit. And, it has tangible consequences. So I remember going to a talk about Brexit where I think it was Owen Jones, ironically, said something about, how Stoke voted to leave. And they were saying that it was mostly to do with immigration. And there are hardly any asylum seekers or immigrants in that part of the world. However, in my part of the world, we welcome refugees. We have refugees and asylum seekers integrating in our community. We have such strong links with the EU and Germany, and I have friends, there and people we work with, and we are embarrassed, and it is very difficult for us. And, importing and exporting goods, even, all of those things have become really difficult. Operation Lorry Park is difficult all the time. So rather than talking about it in some sort of weird, nostalgic, defensive sort of, World War II kind of language, the reality, and especially for young people in my constituency that were going to and from Europe and going to other universities, is very, very different. And I think Boris is an embarrassment in lots of ways, from those pictures of the zip wire in 2012 to the fact that, Keir Starmer's warned today that he's got to really up his game diplomatically before COP26 in November. So I think we are a bit of a laughingstock,
Can I just pick you up on something that you said there? You said your constituency voted to remain. It didn't, did it? It voted to leave. No, it didn't.
My constituency
I'm looking at Kent on...
No, that's the constituency is different from the voting district, and the voting district took into consideration the council area, which has some of Herne Bay, but my constituency, the parts that I'm responsible for, voted to remain.
Well, that's not true because constituencies didn't count.
It is true. I'm the MP there, and I campaigned.
You've got no official figures.
Rosie, I've got an article from Kent Online in front of me. Professor Chris Hanretti says it was just let me finish. 54.7%, he reckons, in your constituency voted to leave. Other people say 52. No, he doesn't.
That isn't 52. True. That's the voting district, and the voting district included different areas like.
I'm talking about your constituency, which includes more than just the city of Canterbury.
It's Canterbury, Whitstable, and the villages, but not Herne Bay and the areas that voted to leave. So my constituency voted to leave. I promise you, and I'll send you if you want to afterwards.
Okay. Well, you just said voted to leave. I think what you meant was voted to remain.
We voted to remain. I'm still remaining.
This reminds me of an interview I did in the last hour. I need a
I promise you, we voted to remain.
All right, okay. I believe you. Right, we're going to move on in a moment. Mike, thank you very much indeed for your question. It's 8:33. Let's get the latest news headlines from Dominic Ellis.
All 16 and 17-year-olds across the UK will start being offered a first dose of the Pfizer COVID jab in the coming weeks. The NHS will begin rolling out first doses of the vaccine ahead of a return to school and colleges in September. Boris Johnson has denied snubbing Scotland's First Minister after she asked for a meeting during his trip to the country today. Nicola Sturgeon has described it as a missed opportunity to hold talks. And Sky Brown has made history as Team GB's youngest ever Olympic medalist with bronze in the skateboarding. There were golds in the women's sailing and show jumping and a bronze and silver in the boxing. And the weather, showers easing for most to leave a mostly dry night with clear spells. Some heavy rain continuing, though, across the northwest and the Northern Ireland, a low of 10 degrees.
LBC.
At Honda.
From Rosie, Duffield, Stewart Jackson, Benjamin Butterworth and Ulf in Hamburg are with me answering your calls. 0345 6060 973. Deborah has texted in from New Cross, who says drug deaths are at a record high. How do we help people deal with the tragedy of addiction? We did a really, really interesting phone-in on this last Saturday. That was mainly to do with Scotland, it has to be said. But the English and Welsh figures came out this week, showing the highest since the figures were starting to be collected in 1993. Let's go to Stewart first on this. It's this war on drugs. Can it ever be won? If it can't be, should it be stopped and a whole new approach adopted?
I don't know the answer as to whether the war can be won. I think if pressed, the instinct is that probably no, because people will always take illicit substances and to excess, whether it's alcohol or hard drugs. But I think it goes back, and it crosses party political boundaries. I think it goes back to the whole concept of troubled families, because so many people who get into drugs as a result of mental illness, emotional trauma, abuse, whether it's sexual or physical or emotional abuse. And I think so much of it can be traced back to troubled and fractured families. And I think we need to get in there very, very early in terms of creating role models, in helping families cope with difficult circumstances, not just financially, but in terms of supporting families continuing and thriving, and the best way to do that is through paid work. Actually, but it's not an issue that we can necessarily break on party lines over. But I think whether any government has the political capital or financial means to do that in our very fractured society, where there are huge pockets, like we've seen in urban Scotland, in the west of Scotland, which has got the worst drug dependency rate and drug death rates in Europe, I'm not sure that we can do that anytime soon, I'm afraid.
It's really interesting in these figures, if you delve into them, the area in England with the lowest rates, which really surprised me, was London. I would have thought that all these sort of urban centres would have been right at the top, but apparently not. Rosie Duffield.
Yeah, I think what's going to be really interesting, actually, is the Scottish Government have this huge wake-up call, haven't they? These figures are absolutely appalling, and they've been in charge for over a decade, and they've said that this is urgent, and they're going to try and sort of tackle it in a whole different way. And I think we're going to have to look at what they're doing and kind of learn from that. I think Stewart's got a point partly, but then if we look at the really high-profile, sort of well-to-do people that weren't from broken families, I'm thinking of sort of people like, Tara Palmer Tompkinson, and people that have really battled publicly with those kind of drug serious problems. It's clear that it isn't just that sort of cut and dried. It's not that straightforward. And, it's interesting what you said about London. I'm guessing that, possibly the old sort of myths about rural areas, not enough to do, not enough stimulation for young people, boredom, unemployment, all of those things probably play a part. So, but yeah, I do agree it's not party political. We have to all help each other in this. Clearly what's been happening hasn't been working, and we have to possibly think of a new approach. But there are plenty of experts who've been saying that for a long time, and I think we just need to have the courage to think again.
Isn't part of the problem that when politicians are in opposition or out of power, they say radical things on drugs policy, and then they get into power and suddenly they just revert to the tried and tested old policies which don't work, and then as soon as they come out of power again, they become radical. I mean, Alan Duncan was a classic one on that, wasn't he? It's actually...
Yeah,
Sorry,
and you can say anything in opposition, can't you? Of course, we can promise the earth and then we have to deliver. So we have to be bold and we have to be brave, and we have to maybe do something that doesn't necessarily look that sort of comfortable to voters, to voters, and we have to think, let's turn to the experts, let's see what is happening. I'll be really, really following what happens in Scotland very closely, and I think as an opposition we should do that.
Ulf, what's the situation like in your home city of Hamburg? Because I remember when I lived in Germany in the 1980s, Hamburg was seen as sort of one of the drug capitals of Germany. Have things changed? What's the national government policy on drugs?
It's Hamburg is much improved. I mean, in those days, when you left the central railway station, certain routes were so filled with addicts you had literally to step over them. Not kidding. Yeah. These days, that open drug scene has been done away with, which doesn't mean that people aren't addicted anymore. Things happen in private apartments these days. It's not much of a policy issue. Hard drugs are illegal. Small quantities, you can get away with. If you're caught dealing, you'll face charges. There's nothing spectacular, frankly. Of course, many drug addicts commit crimes, but the crime rate in Germany is so low at the moment that nobody's worried about it. So we have so many other things to worry about. Crime and drug-related crime is not really high on the agenda.
Okay. Benjamin, my producer, tells me you've been writing about this subject today.
Yeah, I mean, you said that you're surprised that it's lowest in London. I think the thing that leads people to the extent that they die from drug overdose is isolation. And so people that use it in a city like London probably use it socially rather than in isolation, the drugs. But both of my parents were heroin addicts, and I didn't meet my mum until I was an adult because she was addicted to heroin and other drugs and has now got clean. In fact, it's her 49th birthday today.
Happy birthday.
A birthday that she never thought she'd make it to because she was 6 stone and a heroin addict shortly after she had me. But I grew up in
So what you're saying is your mum is younger than me.
Is
thanks,
she?
Yeah.
Well, you look much younger.
That makes me feel
I can't believe that.
But you know,
Sorry, I interrupted.
I grew up in Alderley Edge in Cheshire, which is a very nice part of the world.
Very posh.
It is. And I grew up with my dad, who was a heroin addict. And even though I went to a good state school and was in this nice area, I would go home from school every day to what could only be described as a drug den. My dad and adults I didn't know would be shooting up at home. Now that I'm 29, it occurs to me that many of them will have been younger than me. Some of them died younger than me. Some of my dad's partners died of drug overdoses and the consequences of drugs. And you know, we're talking about the deaths from drugs today, which is far too high. But there is so much more that goes as an effect of a drug addict. You know, those times when I'd get home and they'd be shooting up in the living room and it'd be incredibly violent and I'd be forced to lie at school or to other relatives to hide my own parents' drug use. You know, that's the reality of what happens. And I spent so much time, predictably in the back of a BMW, being taken around Moss Side and places in inner city Manchester, going from drug deal to drug deal, because my dad, who was convicted of this stuff later, was dealing drugs as well as taking them. And that has such a profound effect. And the reason I mentioned where I grew up was because it was a middle class heroin addict. It was the last thing you think of. You know, you think of these people in abject poverty, and that's terrible. But here I was with an eloquent dad, a successful kid at school, that was facing this and that was constantly faced by drug addiction and the violence of it. And I think it is a lot more prevalent than we give credit. And the sad thing is, and the reason that I'm sort of glad to write about it or talk about it, is because the kids of heroin addicts, as I am, don't tend to get very far. They tend to repeat the mistakes of their parents, and they tend to go to prison or be violent or have a drug overdose and die themselves.
So how have you become the exception?
Do you know, my very first memory is being maybe 3 or 4 years old and the house being raided by police because it was a drug den. It was a council estate in Macclesfield at that point before I moved to Alderley Edge. And I remember just having a certainty at that young age, because I was surrounded by such horrendous violence and drug use, that I think there was an inbuilt moral compass that I knew that was wrong and that wasn't who I was. And I think maybe it's the reason I do stuff like giving my opinions as an adult, because it made me quite stubborn and quite certain from a young age. But one of the consequences is that you're then isolated from your own loved ones. You know, my dad and I don't speak anymore because I had to make that decision as a more purposefully as a teenager, that the way he'd behaved and the things he'd done were totally wrong. And, you know, then you have all the other problems that come from that isolation. And I think that's all sorts of issues that drug addiction can raise.
Do you ever see that changing?
In what way?
Breaking off relations with a parent is I imagine, the most incredibly difficult thing that you can really ever do. Do you think that there's ever any chance of reconciliation there?
Well, the interesting thing is that, you know, drugs were never mentioned as such. So even though his whole life as I was a child was shooting up heroin and other drugs, it was never actually said. And even though he's been to prison for it, no one else in the family has ever mentioned it, because in a middle class family they don't confess that happens. And so for me, the reason why I had to make that decision was because if they weren't going to confront it and be honest about that situation, then I had to crack on with my life. And because I had to confront it, I couldn't look the other way. But I think that's probably easier in some ways as a kid that goes out and, you know, gets into university and moves to a different city, than it is for a parent or for a sibling. And I think, you know, this is why you need to stop being, I think, so judgmental of people that get in these situations. Because these rooms that I'd be in as a kid, and, you know, these violent situations in backs of cars and random places in inner city Manchester, they were dark and dingy. And some of these people were from tough homes, some of them were from middle-class homes and had got hooked. And I think if we had less judgment and a more open conversation, and the state providing far more services, explicitly, doctors being able to prescribe counselling and therapy more readily, and the money to fund that, then I think you'd reach a lot more of these people before it got to the point either that they were raising a kid like me in a drug den, or that they were to overdose and die.
Well, I know what I'm going to be reading on the train home tonight, your article in the Eye today, which I'd recommend everybody has a read of. Well, thanks for being so open about it, because it's like when we talk about any social issue, the fact that people in the public eye are open, it does enable people to think, well, actually, that's what I've been through as well. I thought I was the only one. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:49.
This is LBC.
.52, Rosie Duffield, Stewart Jackson, Benjamin Butterworth and Ulf in Hamburg with us answering your questions. Alex is in Watford. Hello, Alex.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. Was
Hi.
Boris Johnson wrong in not meeting Nicola Sturgeon today to talk about recovery for the pandemic, or was he thinking it up on the hoof?
Now, let me explain this a little bit for Ulf, because I'm not sure Ulf will be across this one. Nicola Sturgeon published an open letter inviting Boris Johnson to drop in on her during his visit to Scotland, which is not really the way that political meetings are usually organised. He said no, basically. He would meet with her and Mark Drakeford in Wales and the Northern Irish First Minister, whose name, Paul Given, isn't it? Is that his? I think it is. I've lost track of them. There seem to be so many. And so he said no, he wouldn't. And this has caused a bit of a row today. Rosie Duffield, let's come to you first on this.
I think he should have done. I mean, he's basically in her patch, isn't he? And, what's he afraid of? I mean, COVID isn't a party political issue. It certainly shouldn't be. They should be able to discuss their own approaches, what's worked, what hasn't worked, in a kind of fairly collegiate way, albeit that they're politically opposed. I don't see why he couldn't just have that conversation with her and show willing. I think that would have been a much better look, actually, and much more diplomatic. Okay, you said that these things were sort of pre-arranged, but it's just good manners, isn't it, and good diplomacy to sort of go into someone's territory and sort of have that conversation, or at least go and say hello. I don't really see what the problem is there.
Keir Starmer isn't saying hello either, apparently.
No, but he has said that he's absolutely willing and would like to meet with Nicola Sturgeon. They've met before. I think he just sort of said he ruled out a coalition. He ruled out talking at great length about independence. But yeah, I think he'd be prepared to talk about COVID approaches at least.
Stewart Jackson, is this a storm in a teacup, or should Boris have just sort of said, I mean, he is the Prime Minister, she is the First Minister of Scotland. He met the Belarusian opposition leader in Downing Street the other day. If he can meet the Belarusian opposition leader, why on earth can't he meet Nicola Sturgeon?
Well, I think there's more of a meeting of minds in the former than the latter. This is the endless Sturgeon grievance machine, which is all about not being held to account for an appalling record on health, on education, for the fact they've no real plans post-independence. It's all about independence. And, why should he meet her? I mean, he's been very decent and civilised over the years with her, and all she's done is leak information early, trying to upstage him, having press conferences before him, and it's just all about it's like North Korean style.
But what you're saying is she's a good politician.
Well,
he's not.
Look, he is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's not her territory, inverted commas. It's part of the United Kingdom. And frankly, he can choose who he wants to meet. If she's got a problem with that, then there are ways she can deal with it. I mean, I worked in the Department for Exeter in the EU. We met regularly with Mike Russell, who was the Constitutional Affairs guy for the SNP, and the then Prime Minister Theresa May did meet Mark Drayford and Nicola Sturgeon. But it's all, as I say, it's always this grievance machine of what leverage we can get in order to embarrass the UK government and drive up support for independence, which is lamentably failing because support for independence is dropping like a stone, and it will drop like a stone as people begin to see the economic ramifications of such a disastrous policy.
Benjamin Butterworth.
I mean, I just thought it's an unbelievably stupid thing to do. First of all, they run Scotland together. They share different powers. And so if he's going to be visiting, I dare say it would be constructive and helpful at this time of national crisis still for them to sit down and work out things, especially given the disparities in the COVID rules and all the confusions about that. But there's another factor here, and that's the looming Scottish independence referendum. And it is so close. The polling looks like it's shifted, so it's just slightly in favour of the Union over independence in about the past year. But given how tight it is, and how there are going to be SNP voters who would also vote to stay in the Union, because they are slightly different groups of people, we know that from the past couple of years, is he really going to be convincing them of the merits of the construct of his governance and of the United Kingdom by simply refusing to meet with the democratically elected First Minister of Scotland? No, of course he's not. And I fear from the way Boris Johnson keeps behaving is that he plays so hard to this English nationalism that gave him the stomping majority that he has in Westminster, that he is doing it at the expense of a nation of the United Kingdom in a referendum that seems pretty inevitable in the coming years.
Charles in Alderley Edge, see that place again. You're setting a trend there, Benjamin. He says, do you agree that Nicola Sturgeon runs rings around Johnson? He should have arranged to meet her without her having to write to him. Bury your fragile ego, Johnson, says Charles. Ulf, imagine a situation where Angela Merkel was visiting the Minister-President of Bavaria and she refused to meet him. It's unthinkable. OK, they are similar parties, I suppose. That's where the analogy doesn't quite work, but it would be unthinkable, wouldn't it?
Of course. Our entire system is based upon constant communication and cooperation of all parties and all office holders involved. It just doesn't work if you don't do that. And, well, yeah, the whole culture of, well, okay, let's put it this way. We don't have any minister president who is a secessionist. that would make things a bit different too in Germany, but that situation is unheard of. Everybody will talk.
They come close to him. They come close to in Bavaria, don't they?
No, not even close. Their motto is Bavaria strong in Germany, Germany strong in Europe. No way.
Okay.
There is a secessionist party in Bavaria. A few thousand idiots. Really.
You wouldn't call the SNP members idiots, though, would you?
No, of course not. They think that the EU is the better union to belong to. I agree.
Yeah, as long as the English taxpayer is paying for it.
Well, once they have left, they won't do that anymore. So you should be for it.
All right, Alex, what do you think?
George Orwell's better than War. What's wrong with the man?
Yeah, okay. That will be the last word on that. We have a time for one quick text at the end. Ellie in Taunton says, Rihanna is now officially a billionaire. What would you do with $1 billion? We've all thought about that, haven't we, at some point in our lives, what we would do if we got incredibly filthy rich. Rosie Duffield, what would you do with $1 billion?
It's probably obvious that I would say I'd help my local charities and the homeless shelter and all of those kind of things in my constituency, but I would also buy lots more shoes because I have a bit of a shoe problem. So, yeah, the sparklier, the better.
The Imelda Marcos of Canterbury. Benjamin.
I mean, $1 billion, I think I'd get maybe a one-bed flat in South London, judging by how expensive house prices are. Do you know, I've never really thought about it, but I actually think being a billionaire, and who's going to weep for billionaires, I dare say it's more of a burden than you would imagine. Because if I suddenly had that much money, and as Rosie referred to, be able to do stuff for so many people if you wish to, I would actually find that an incredible pressure on my shoulders, because I think being that rich comes with a moral responsibility, the likes of which Bill Gates executes so well, that I'd be pretty uncomfortable having that much money.
Oh, I think I could cope. Stewart?
Well, I'd probably buy a space station for Elon Musk and Richard Branson on the basis that it was a one-way ticket and they wouldn't come back.
Ulf, what would you spend it on?
I would secure my own position, help my friends and my family, look for a worthy cause that needs that much money, and I can't just offhand what that would be.
I think the Iain Dale Retirement Fund would be a very worthy cause for you, Ulf. Thank you very much to all four of you for coming on the programme tonight. Stewart Jackson, Ulf in Hamburg, Rosie Duffield and Benjamin Butterworth. In a moment, we're going to talk about the fact that 3/4 of people in Britain believe that there should be new laws on assisted suicide, but only a third of MPs do. We want your views on that. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, all 16 and 17-year-olds across the UK will start being offered a first dose of the